or start? And yes, so we started the recording. I assume that you both confirmed while I was not here yet. Okay, I see nodding heads. Just for the protocol.
I do confirm. I'm not sure if I clicked a bunch of buttons, so I'm not sure if that was one of them, but I confirm.
Great, thank you. Okay, then I'd start, right? Okay. Hi everybody. We are here for Erik Bleich's presentation of his and Moritz van der Ween's new book covering Muslims. It's part of our DeIslam lecture series. We started the lecture series in 2021. We had 3 of them in December 2021. And now we are delighted to have Erik today with us to present his recently published book. It's being published in March 2022. So we are, it's the last day of March, so we can, promote that we had you in March, in the month your book was launched. It's a book co-written with Moritz van der Ween, as I said already, and the whole series is located at the Berlin Institute for Integration and Migration Research. We are the German Islam team, which is based at the Humboldt-Universität, and the German Islam team is a research project funded by the German Ministry for Education and Research for 3 years. And we have a wonderful team of colleagues. Naika Furutan and I are the PIs of that project. And we have 5 doctoral assistants in the project, of which Fatima El Sayed is one, but also Nader Hutaid, Emeti Alish, Rami Ali, Bastian Neuhauser, and then our great student assistant, Anis Saidam. And the project's title is German Islam as alternative to Islamism, with a question mark at the end, because we approach it as a question and not as a statement. So this is who we are, where we come from, who the organizers of this event are. And next, I would give the words to Fatima to introduce Erik, after which I would introduce Asmaa, and then the floor would be yours, Erik, to present the book.
Yeah, thank you very much, Özgür. It's a great pleasure to have you, Erik and Asmaa. A very well welcome also from my side. And I'm going to introduce you, Professor Erik Bleich. So Erik Bleich is Charles A. Dana Professor of Political Science at Middlebury College. His book covering Muslims, American newspapers in comparative perspective couples big data analysis of more than 1.6 million articles with readings of individual texts. It shows the striking negativity in coverage of Muslims across time, country, and topics, as well as compared to groups as diverse as Catholics, Jews, Hindus, African Americans, Latinos, Mormons, and atheists. His broader research interests revolve around the topics of race and ethnicity in West European and North American politics. He's the author of Race Politics in Britain and France, Ideas in Policymaking since the 1960s, and The Freedom to be Racist, How the United States and Europe Struggle to Preserve Freedom and Combat Racism. He has also published on the concept of Islamophobia, the status of Muslims, hate crimes, political violence, ethnic rights, theories of immigration and integration, and the legacy of colonial history on contemporary policymaking. His articles have appeared in journals such as Comparative Political Studies, Comparative Politics, Ethnic and Racial Studies, Social Forces, Theory, and Society. He has served as a chair of the Executive Committee of the Council for European Studies, as a member of the Councils of the American Political Science Association, and as a Fulbright Tocqueville Distinguished Chair in 2022. So very warm welcome. We are very honored, and it's a great pleasure to have you here, Professor Erik Bleich.
And now I would continue with introducing our today's discussant, who is Asmaa Soliman. And Dr. Asmaa Soliman is director of the Young Islam Conference, as well as co-director of the Competence Network Living Together in Our Migration Society Society at the Schwarzkopf Foundation Young Europe in Berlin. The social scientist has studied in Maastricht and London, where she has worked at LSE and UCL and conducted her PhD. Its results have been published in her book, European Muslims Transforming the Public Sphere, which examines the engagement of young Muslims in the areas of media, arts, and culture, as well as civil society. Dr. Soliman has worked in several international scientific research studies, as well as practice-based projects. Her expertise includes Muslims in Europe, post-migrant societies, diversity, intercultural relations, participation, intersectional discrimination, anti-discrimination, empowerment, and youth. Also, a very warm welcome from my side, Asmaa, Soliman. It's great to having you. It's great to have this constellation. And of course, we are taking advantage of the situation that Erik is in France this year for a visiting fellowship, which means that we could escape the difference in the time zones. So this is why we can have this event at 11 a.m. The floor is yours, Erik. We are looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Fatima, for that nice introduction, and Özgür and Gökçe for inviting me to do this, and the whole team, really. And Asmaa for volunteering to respond. I'm really looking forward to your thoughts and comments. As you just heard, this is a book that's co-written with Maurits van der Veen, who is lurking in the background off screen. So I'm gonna, Maurits, you can be my plant and you can ask all the good questions that don't come out naturally in the discussion, but please only ask the ones that you know I have the answers to. All right, so this project, let me just see if I can advance the slides. There we go. Starts with, you may wonder, why are we focused on Muslims? And actually in this crowd, there's probably not a lot of question about that, but sometimes we do get this question, you know, what's distinctive, what's different, what's special? Why are you interested in this topic? And for us, there are a few obvious and compelling answers. It's clearly Islam is a major world religion with lots of followers around the world. But for Maurits and me, who are focused a lot more on European societies and North American societies, they're also a significant population in the global North. Muslims are obviously prominent in academic and public discussions, dating back a long time, moving through sort of left-leaning, right-leaning activists, opponents, political, academic. So they're kind of in the public consciousness for a lot of people. And they face a lot of stigmatization, right? Muslims are the victims, the targets of a lot of stigmatization. And in our case, our primary focus in this book is on the United States. You'll see from this slide that 50% of Americans surveyed in 2017 believe Islam is not part of mainstream American society, and 41% believe that Islam encourages violence more than other faiths. So it's kind of a dramatic issue for a lot of countries, a lot of places. But then the next question you might ask is, well, why focus on the media? Because Asmaa's work is not necessarily as focused on the media. There are a lot of questions you could ask in this realm. For us, we're interested in the media because it's a significant information source, and it turns out to be the top information source for most Americans about Muslims in the United States. And media affect attitudes in ways that have been studied in a bunch of different locations. So it turns out that in the same Pew survey from 2007, not only do most Americans get their information about Muslims and Islam from the media, if you get your information from the media, you are more likely to feel negatively about Muslims than if you get your information from other sources like personal relationships or education. A very big study in New Zealand also showed that just simply consuming more media correlates with more negative attitudes towards Muslims, whether the media is about, nominally about Muslims or not. Just being media consumers makes you more negative. And then finally, there have been a series of survey experiments by Muniba Salim and many of her colleagues and others as well that show that if you have more exposure to stories about Muslims, you exhibit more support for civil restrictions of Muslim Americans and also for foreign policy that is perceived to be anti-Muslim. So there's a lot that's known about media coverage of Muslims. It won't surprise you to hear that there's a scholarly consensus that coverage of Muslims is negative. And this consensus comes from a lot of different kinds of studies, including some that focus on close readings of relatively small numbers of articles, contextual readings, and others that do systematic analyses of large corpora, bodies of articles touching on Muslims. One meta-analysis of the literature says Muslims tend to be negatively framed. Islam is dominantly portrayed as a violent religion. So this is sort of what is common knowledge. It's also common knowledge among scholars, prominent scholars dating back decades, and among activists who are, in the contemporary era, engaged in promoting equality and condemning, therefore, some of the media coverage that seems to flow regularly from American media sources. And this is not only known by scholars and by activists and by politicians, it's also known by comedians. This is Maz Jobrani. He's an Iranian-American comedian. And yeah, I'm going to play a very brief clip, about a less than a minute long clip of his routine from 2012 to give his impression of what the media is like.
So they always show the crazy dude wearing the American flag going, "Death to America!" Always that guy. Just once, I wish they would show us doing something good, man. Right? Just once, right? Yeah, man. Show us doing something good, like, like baking a cookie or something, right? Because I've been to Iran, we have cookies. Just once, I want CNN to be like, now we're going to go to Muhammad in Iran. They go to some guys like, hello, I'm Muhammad, and I'm just baking a cookie. I swear to God, no walk, no flags, nothing. Back to you, Bob. The whole news piece. They're never going to do that. Even if they ever did that, they followed up with another news piece. They'd be like, this just in, a cookie bomb just exploded. Muhammad, you sneaky parachan.
So these are the impressions, the widespread impressions of how Muslims are covered in the media and how difficult it is to find positive stories about Muslims in the media. But that, I think, that widespread knowledge actually hides a little bit some things that we don't know that are important to know. The first is just how negative are Muslim articles compared to, for example, the average news story. So, the standard trope in the media is if it bleeds, it leads, right? So negative stories are well known to be overrepresented in the media. Maybe it's the case that stories about Muslims are not that different, or maybe not different at all from the average story in the American media. Maybe they're not that different from stories that touch on other similar analogous groups, right? Maybe it's the case that when the media covers Muslims, or when they cover Jews, or when they cover African Americans, it's because there's some sort of conflict involved, and therefore that explains the negativity, but it's not just specific to Muslims. Maybe it has something to do with 9/11, right? Maybe coverage was actually okay prior to 9/11. Maybe it was really negative just after 9/11, and maybe it's rebounded and not so bad now. And then the other thing we are interested in is how negative are Muslim articles in the United States compared to coverage in other countries. So the United States may be a distinctive place for a lot of reasons that you can imagine, and distinctively negative. The next question that I think we don't really know is what accounts for the negativity, right? If articles are negative, why are they negative? And I say this because when Maurits and I tell people that we're looking at negativity in articles touching on Muslims, a lot of people just be like, well, yeah, of course they're negative because of X, right? But X is always a little bit different, or often a little bit different, depending on who we talk to. So is it because the coverage is about foreign locations? Is it because of terrorism? Is it because of culture clashes, right? The perceived culture clashes between Muslims in the West and non-Muslims in the West? And then the last question here is, well, okay, so what happens if we control for those stories, right? Are the stories then neutral, average, positive? What do they look like at that point? And so these are the questions that we investigate. What's coverage like compared to the average newspaper article, other racialized and religious groups, coverage in other countries? And to what extent is negativity driven by things that the literature has identified as potentially important? Foreign news, coverage of other places tends to be more negative. Violent events tend to be covered in a negative way. Some of the cultural differences that I just mentioned, but also newspaper type and leaning. So are tabloid newspapers more negative than broadsheet newspapers? Are right-leaning newspapers more negative than left-leaning newspapers? And then, you know, as I said, to what extent is negativity driven by 9/11? Okay, I'm going to talk about our data a little bit and our methods. And then I'm just going to give you, everybody who's listening, kind of fair warning that at the end of the methods section, I'm going to kind of take a pause and see if there are any questions about the data or methods. This can get super technical, so I'm going to try to make it not super technical, but I do want to make sure that people are comfortable with the broad overview of what we've got in terms of data and how we analyze what we've got, because that'll kind of shape the discussion going forward. So for our data, we collected all articles, every single article mentioning the religion or its adherents or any related words beginning with these stems. And our shorthand for this, this body of articles is our Muslim articles or the Muslim corpus. We did the same thing for articles about Catholics, Jews, Hindus, atheists, Mormons, African Americans, or Latinos. And I just made the slip of saying about. I really should say articles that mention these groups, because any article that has these words, these keywords in them, we pull into our corpus, our data set. Where do we get these articles? From 17 national and regional US newspapers with different characteristics from the time period of 1996 to 2016. That's January 1st to December 31st. So that winds up being 21 years. And that's 256,963 Muslim articles. That's a lot of articles. And in case you've ever downloaded these from ProQuest or Factiva or Nexus Uni, you know that this is a tedious labor of love. So this is quite a lot of time we spent doing these downloads. I like to joke that my colleague and co-author Mauritz's idea of a perfect Friday night is a glass of red wine and 20,000 downloads. He can tell me if he agrees with that, but it's a lot of time, it's a lot of effort to do this kind of work. And we wound up downloading over 1 million articles total across all the groups in the United States, and then another few 100,000 when we look at Muslims abroad. I'm not going to go into this or ask you to look at this in too much detail, but I just want to give you a sense of the range of newspapers that we did download from. They include national, regional, and tabloid newspapers divided by those black lines, and left-leaning, right-leaning, and neither left nor right-leaning papers as identified by the color coding of the newspapers. I can say more about how we arrived at those codings if anybody's interested. We use a few different kinds of methods to analyze the data. The first is something that's broadly called lexical sentiment analysis. We developed a new method for doing this called multi-lex scaled. We use existing dictionaries, lexica of positive and negative words in order to measure the tone of individual articles. So essentially imagine that you have an article that you're reading and you essentially match every word in that article to an existing dictionary of positive and negative words. By the way, these people, I'm sure, sat up with lots of glasses of wine and made lists of positive and negative words. But that's what these dictionaries look like. And so, you know, the cat jumped, that may have no sentiment at all. High may be a positive word in some dictionaries. You know, fell and hurt itself, right? Hurt is probably a negative word. So you match all of those individual words to the positive and negative words in these dictionaries, and you come out with a tone score for each article. But what we do is we standardize an average across multiple independently validated dictionaries rather than using just one of them. There are many dictionaries out there. We use 8 that have been extremely validated. We use them all because they were all designed for slightly different purposes. So they contain very different numbers of positive and negative words. Some contain, 1,500 positive and negative words. Some contain 15,000. Some are scaled, either it's a positive word or it's a negative word. Some have a more refined continuous scale. So we want to take advantage of all of these dictionaries when we do our work. And then the final thing we do is we scale the valence of all of the articles against a representative corpus of US newspaper articles. And I'll say a bit more about that on the next slide. But here, what you need to know is that a score of +1 means that an article is 1 standard deviation more positive than the average in the representative corpus, where the average is set to 0. Again, I'll unpack a little bit of this, and I'll leave time for questions in case people have them. So here are just a couple of method details. Again, we tally positive and negative words. We use 8 externally validated sentiment lexica. We also account for negation and amplification, which means not good gets a score that is not the same as good. Very good gets that is lower than good. Very good gets a score that is higher than good. And we adjust the score for each lexicon, and we average across all 8 based on our benchmark parameters, which are established by our representative corpus. Okay, this is, I want to slow down here for a second and talk about the representative corpus. What is a representative corpus, right? The idea is, what does an average newspaper article look like? Is it positive or negative? Well, some people may think it's positive, some people may think it's negative. So we draw essentially a quasi-random sample of 48,135 articles from all of our papers across all of our years. And we say, what is the average tone among all of those articles? Right. So whether you may think it's objectively positive or objectively negative doesn't really matter. What matters is what's the average American newspaper article like in terms of its positivity and negativity. So that is 0. That's our 0 point. That's our mean for the representative corpus, and then against which we judge all other articles and all other corpora. And then we set the standard deviation of that representative corpus. We reshape it so the standard deviation is 1, which is a common way to gauge kind of variation in the corpus in mathematics and computer science. But that doesn't tell you much about the substance and what this means. What does a score of 1 mean, or -1 mean? And so this is a scale we developed based on running several dozen different corpora to see how do they measure up relative to the 0 point of our representative corpus. And this is a shorthand for thinking about substantive significance, by which I mean, if the average of a corpus of articles, Muslim corpus, Jewish corpus, Catholic corpus, Latino corpus, atheist corpus, if it's between -0.1 and 0.1, we think of it as essentially neutral, right? Close enough to 0 that substantively it's neutral, sort of like the representative corpus, like the average articles in American newspapers. If it's between -0.1 and -0.3, we think of it as modestly negative. It's negative, but it's not super negative. Between -0.3 and -0.5, it's clearly negative, undisputably, but more negative than -0.5 is very negative, strongly negative, right? That's where you're getting into articles, and especially corpora, that really stand out from the rest. So that's the substantive scale, and I want to make sure that that's clear. This is just a quick and dirty way to get a sense of how positive or negative things are. More negative than -0.5 is strongly negative. Okay, we also validated this method by asking, well, okay, so we have these numbers, we have these scores. Can people actually tell, right? When you read articles of different valences, at what point can you tell if they are different? And the answer to this question, happily, is yes. People can tell what's more positive and what's more negative. And we found this out by doing an experiment to see if readers could identify differences in tone. We confronted readers on Crowdflower, which is very similar, now defunct, very similar to Amazon's Mechanical Turk, which some people will be familiar with. People just kind of sign up to do tasks. And we confronted them with sets of sentences that were a little more positive, a little more negative, a lot more positive, a lot more negative, at the entire range of our scale. So they might be comparing vignettes, we call these vignettes, that are negative 0.75 and negative 0.2, or a vignette that is negative 0.1 and positive 1.1, right? So we accordioned the difference in tone and the place on the tone scale for about 3,800 different pairings. And if you think about it for a second, if you're guessing which is more positive and which is more negative, it's a coin flip. You're going to get it right half the time. You're going to get it wrong half the time. That's 50%. So what we wanted to know is, did people do better than 50%? And the answer is yes. Even at a 0.1 gap, 60% of the answers could tell which was more positive and which was more negative. By the time you get up to a 0.5 gap, 2/3 of respondents got that answer right. And by the time you get up to 0.92, 3/4 got it right. And by the time you're at 2-point difference, basically everybody can tell. Okay, a couple of other methodological tools that we use: features and collocations. Features are just simply sets of words present or absent in an article that tell us something about what topic is being covered in that article. So again, think about a giant spreadsheet where all the text of each article is in a row, and you create a column called violence. And you put a 1 in there if the article contains any of the words in the subcategories of terrorism, war, insurgency, or violent Islam. So does the article have that word, 1 or more? Yes. Well, then there's a 1 in that box. No, there's a 0. So that's what a feature does. We also geolocate articles based on presence of country or city markers. So we can tell something about what the article is talking about. Is it talking about a domestic location, a foreign location, both, neither, right? So that's the geolocation feature. And we use collocations, which are words that are likely to appear in the context closest to the words Muslim or Islam. So the words directly to the left that are typically adjectives that modify the noun, or directly to the right, which are typically nouns that modify the adjective, such as Islamic. So we focus on words that appear disproportionately in those positions. The final method that I'm going to talk briefly about and come back to a little bit later is topic modeling. Topic modeling is designed to identify clusters of words that hang together or frequently appear together in all of our articles. So we basically, we use an algorithm called non-negative matrix factorization. And essentially, I think of it like a kind of snake that wends its way through all of the words in all of the articles and identifies little clusters of words that tend to hang together. And it pulls out those clusters as topics and identifies a series of words that it sees as clustering together. And it highlights in these word clouds that you see the most common prominent words in those clusters. And then you, as the researcher, name that cluster something sort of logical and intuitive based on what it gives you as a cluster of words. So this cluster of words is the Al-Qaeda and Bin Laden topic. Okay, here's a good point for us to take a little breath and ask, are there any questions about any of the methods, something that you think is critical that you don't understand or want to follow up on a little bit? I think I can take these questions from panelists directly. And if you're in the audience, I don't know if I will see the chat or the Q&A. So
we are checking the chat. So there are no questions yet. But if there would be one, I would read it out loudly here.
Okay, good. And Özgür, did all this resonate with you? You followed along?
Fatima? I followed it, and I'm really interested because, as you know, we are working on this paper, or we have prepared a manuscript. So it sounds very familiar. But of course, there are some more features since you wrote a book and we are writing a paper manuscript.
Right, good, okay. Well, maybe I do see one Q&A question, but Asmaa, you may also want to ask a question at this point, given that you may have questions later. So I don't know if you want to save those or ask them now, but I do see something, I do see a Q&A.
Yeah, I will save my questions for later.
Okay, great. Özgür, can you see the Q&A and tell me if it's related to the methods?
There is a question actually.
Well, there is no question in the chat yet. As far
I can read it out.
Oh, okay, there is, yeah, okay, yeah. No, right now I'm seeing 2 questions. Would you like to read them, Fatima?
Yeah, sure. So one question is regarding the topic modeling, that it can be quite messy on big data. So how distinctive were the topics from each other? That is the first question.
They were notably distinctive, right? So there were a couple of topics that that come out of NMF topic models that are called junk topics. They just are, random words that don't hang together. But there were really, I think, only 2 of those. And the rest of the topics were all fairly coherent. There was maybe a little bit of overlap in a few of them, maybe 2 or 3 topics had some overlap, but they were actually fairly distinctive. I'll add one more small point, which is we did kind of clump them together, which we'll see later in the presentation, in broader themes like foreign coverage, right? But in the foreign coverage, each of the individual topics were relatively distinctive.
Now we are having 2 more questions, again by another Taid. And he's saying, with all the pros with sentiment analysis, how did you assure you were talking about quote unquote negative coverage of Muslims and not quote unquote the proximity of Muslims to bad words?
Yeah, I will. I'll say more about that going forward. That's a challenge, but I think one that we can't perfectly overcome, but one that we can deal with based on looking at subsets of articles that are most likely to portray Muslims, for example, as victims, as opposed to doing bad things, that tend to be small. But the other thing I would say is there's kind of a debate in the literature about whether placing Muslims next to negative words, even if the point of those negative words is to portray Muslims as victims, for example, as opposed to perpetrators. Just the proximity of the words Muslim and Islam to negative words over and over and over again has a kind of, there's a debate about this, but has a kind of negative impact on the associations people make between Muslims and negativity. It reinforces that point, even if some of the purpose of those articles is to say Muslims are also victims of violence as opposed to perpetrators of violence.
Mm-hmm. Great, and that's now it's the final question coming, and it relates to the first question as far as I understand. So another is asking how you assure the distinctiveness, and I guess it relates to the topic models. And I asked whether you had or did not have any pre-processing steps, some discriminating actions to pre-configure the distinctiveness.
We do. I mean, we clean the data. So this is maybe a little bit technical and probably best to follow up with an email to me or to Maurits afterwards. There is some pre-processing that we undertake before we do the topic models, but it's pretty standard pre-processing. So I would say, you know, if there's a concern about sort of the data being biased in any way, then I'm not super concerned about that, because the steps that we take are pretty standard steps. Great.
I also agree that this is very technical for some of our participants in the audience. So another you can take it to an after email exchange or
absolutely. Yeah, happy to do that. Yep. Okay.
So that is yeah. There's no further question.
Okay, great. So what did we find? Right. Let's get into the actual substance of what we found. The first question, you know, I just want to kind of get you to ask in your minds, how negative do you think Muslim articles are? Not in general, right? Because we know in general, lots of studies have found they're negative, but how negative do you think they are relative to the average article in the American media, right? Are they modestly, I'm going to give you a clue. They're not positive. They're not essentially neutral, right? Are they modestly negative, clearly negative, strongly negative? The answer is they are strongly negative. They're essentially off the charts, strongly negative. Right, a negative 0.94 means that the average article about Muslims, the average article mentioning Muslims containing the word Muslim or Islam as a root is more negative than 84% of the articles in our representative corpus. That's really, really negative. So when you're reading an article about that touches on Muslims or Islam, you have to read 5 articles to find one, to have the odds be good that you're going to find one that is neutral, right? The other ones are going to be extremely negative. Then we asked ourselves, okay, well, maybe these are articles that are negative that just mention Muslims in passing, right? So there are indeed about 2/3 of the articles in our data set just mention Muslims or Islam once. So we took out all those articles. We basically said, we want articles that mention Muslims or Islam at least 3 times, right? These are going to be articles that are more likely to be about Muslims rather than just touch on Muslims. And the finding is that they're even more negative, right? When you weed down the articles to the ones that are really likely to be about Muslims, they get even more negative. And then we said, okay, well, maybe it's possible that these articles contain a lot of negative words, but they're not negative in sentences that mention Muslims or Islam. So we went back to all 256,000 articles, and we basically said, let's take each article and find all the sentences in it that contain the word Muslim or Islam and keep those, and just weed out all the other sentences and condense that article to articles that are stripped down to just include Muslim sentences. 1, 2, 5, 18, however many sentences there are. The tone here is even more negative. So the argument that we're making is the more the articles mention Muslims, or the closer you get to the word Muslim or Islam in a sentence, even more negative those articles become. And just to give you a sense of the difference between a sentence that has a valence of 0 and one that has a valence of negative 0.94, this is a sentence with a valence of 0. Very bland, very neutral. This is what neutral feels like. This is what negative 0.94 feels like. Right, so you would not mistake these two for being equivalent in terms of the negativity. The difference between a 0 and a negative 0.94 is noticeable to, I would imagine, pretty much everybody. And it's very different when you look at how Muslim articles compare to articles touching on other groups, right? There is a gap between these groups. The valence for Muslims is not like the valence for Catholic articles or Jewish articles, which are both essentially neutral, nor is it like the valence for articles touching on Hindus, which is modestly negative. Right? We chose these groups because at one time or another, some might argue still today, all of these groups have been or are minorities in the United States, both in the numerical sense, but also in the kind of sociological sense of being seen as outsiders. Hindus have roughly the same percentage of the population in the United States as Muslims do. They're also not perceived as white in most cases. They're a major global religion, and yet the outcomes are strikingly different. Not only that, but the gap is growing, right? So if Muslim articles have been roughly the same in terms of their valence over these 21-year time period, the other groups have gotten modestly more positive. So this is something that is not only true overall, but is in some ways more true now than ever before. The next question we ask is why? Why do we see this gap? What's going on? And as it sort of alluded to earlier, previous literature, previous scholarship has focused on what you might think of as 7 different elements that might explain why coverage of Muslims is negative. Again, it's X, like obviously articles about Muslims are more negative because they're often set exclusively abroad. There's violence and conflict. They mention fundamentalism, extremism, or religiosity, which may not be in favor in the American media, or value clashes over headscarves or child rearing or gender relations or something like that, or because of the political leaning of a newspaper or the type of newspaper, tabloid or broadsheet. So we wanted to know which of these is explaining the most negativity, and taken together, do these factors eliminate the Muslim gap? And the answer is, we ran a regression pooling articles about all 4 of these groups. And the answer is no, right? The Muslim gap remains. So controlling for all of these things, what you see is foreign setting, exclusively foreign setting of an article, articles that touch on violence or extremism or are published in a tabloid newspaper. Those are the factors that are doing most of the work to explain negativity. But even controlling for all of those things, articles about Muslims are still substantially more negative than articles about other major religious groups. Then we said, okay, well, maybe it has something to do with the idea of Muslims as a global religion or Muslims abroad, where American readers and journalists may be skeptical. But what about Muslim Americans, right? What if we focus just on the subset of articles that mention Muslim Americans specifically, or only mention the United States? So they're talking about Muslims, but they're located in an American setting. And what if we compared articles about Muslim Americans to disadvantaged groups within the United States, racial ethnic groups, but also religious groups? Religion is in quotations here because, of course, atheists are not technically a religious group. What do these articles look like? The answer is, well, there's some good news, I guess, which is that articles about Muslim Americans are less negative than articles about Muslims overall. But the bad news is they're still strongly negative and not comparable to articles about any of these other groups, which again tend to be essentially neutral or modestly negative. But not so for Muslim Americans. It's at our threshold of strongly negative. I want to shift gears now and talk about change over time, right? A lot of people, and I would say we did too at the beginning, thought clearly 9/11 drove a lot. It must have changed a lot in coverage of Muslims. Maybe the negative coverage is an artifact of really negative coverage in the wake of 9/11, but maybe otherwise it looks a little different and perhaps not so bad. So we had some expectations about the effects of 9/11. The first is that there would be what scholars of communication call a media storm. There'd be pressure to compete for attention with other media outlets, and therefore the volume of articles would go up. The second hypothesis essentially comes from the securitization literature, that people would frame Muslims in a negative way and articles would get much more negative. And the third looks at how a seminal event can reframe discussions of a group, and our thoughts were that mentions of terrorism and extremism would spike. We were right on the first point. You get exactly 0 credit for guessing where 9/11 is on this timeline. But the more important thing I think here is to note that that dotted line at the bottom, sitting at about 21 or 22, is the pre-9/11 average number of articles published per day in these newspapers. And what you see after 9/11 is not just that spike in the immediate aftermath, but that the number stays high, right? What was once an average becomes sort of like a lower boundary for the number of articles per day. And most time periods, for years at a time, it is well above that lower boundary. However, 9/11 didn't change everything, not exactly in the way we expected. It did not actually have a major effect on valence, right? It didn't drop dramatically. It had been declining since late 2000 after the USS Cole bombing, and it obviously stayed low for quite a while after 9/11. But what you don't see is that the equivalent of the upward spike in the number of stories, some sort of downward spike in the tone. So it did not have a major effect on tone, at least not one that is as visible as the spike in the number of articles. However, it did change discussions of extremism and terrorism, right? Again, I'll let this figure sink in and speak for itself. Terrorism and extremism, much more common in articles touching on Muslims after 9/11 than before, and remains at an elevated level all throughout our post-9/11 time period. All right, countries. We wondered if the US was an outlier, right? It's a major global power. It's involved in lots of countries in the world. You know, it was a victim of 9/11 attacks, lots of stuff going on that may lead us to believe that led us to believe that the United States was going to be a lot more negative than most other countries. We compared to Britain, Canada, and Australia. And as a dual Canadian citizen, I was so excited to look into this data. I was like, oh my God, Canada is totally going to represent. We're going to show up the United States. Things are going to be much better in Canada. But no, that just didn't work out that way. In fact, what's really striking about this figure is just how similar all of these countries are. I mean, you almost couldn't get a more perfect overlap of the three other countries than you have here. And what you see in this figure is that the United States is actually modestly, very small amount, less likely to have super negative articles and more likely to have just regularly very negative articles about Muslims than its counterparts. What drives the negativity? Also extremely similar in these countries. Right? These are just clusters of the major factors in these 4 different countries, and the amazing similarity across countries jumped out at us right away. The tabloid data is a little bit more widespread. Still, everything is negative and relatively negative at that. Canada, we only had 1 tabloid. It's based in Vancouver, so maybe this is where the kind of Canadian nice, you know, affects the results that we get. Then we wondered, okay, well, so is there a global media discourse about Muslims, right? This indicates perhaps or suggests perhaps that, you know, when newspapers are covering Muslims and Islam, there are just a certain set of things that have to be written about, and they have to be written about kind of in the same way. And, you know, this looks true if you look at the global north or the Anglophone north, the 4 countries that we just looked at. The average valence is very similar, whether you scale all of the articles against the US benchmark representative corpus, or if you scale them against a national sample, so a national representative corpus. We had more glasses of wine and downloaded more articles from each of these individual countries to get a national representative corpus. And you'll see the Britain numbers move a little bit, mostly because there are a lot of tabloids in the British corpus. So if you're benchmarking tabloids against a lot of tabloids, it doesn't look quite as bad, but basically everything stays the same. However, it's not true that there is a global media discourse. It doesn't have to be this way. And there's a lot going on in this image. So I'm going to ask you basically to focus on the 2 numbers circled in red, which get at, and I should say a little bit about this data. This is, we view this as kind of a probe. We found 1 major English language newspaper in each of these countries. And we pulled this data from 2015 through 2020. Might be 2016 through 2020. and said, we want some Muslim majority countries, some Muslim minority countries in similar regions to see what the data looks like. And what you'll see on the right is the Kenyan newspaper is just as negative as the newspapers in the global north. Not much different. So it can be the case that other places write about Muslims and Islam in using negative words. The Malaysia story is very different, right? It's actually positive. So the Malaysian newspaper obviously does not think that there's a global media discourse, that you don't have to write about Muslims and Islam in exactly the same way as everybody else. Many of the positive stories in Malaysia, we looked into it a little bit, are about things like the finance industry, right? Islamic finance in Malaysia is a big industry. So some of them are country specific, but they're also topic specific. And in India, for example, a lot of the stories were about the Muslim community within India. So these are, this shows that there doesn't have to be the same global discourse everywhere in every country exactly the same way. All right, our final topic before we get to the conclusion is topics, right? So when newspapers write about Muslims, what do they write about? And this is where I come back to the topic modeling discussion that we had a little bit earlier. You'll see the Al-Qaeda and Bin Laden topic here on the left, and also a topic that we call law and order, courts, trials, convicted, journey, so attorney, prosecutor, et cetera. So what do newspapers write about? What are the topics embedded in these articles? And this is much more of an inductive approach, right? We kind of want to let the words speak for themselves. We want to let the articles speak for themselves to bring out what is covered in these articles. So we looked at the most prominent topic in each of the articles that we covered. And before I go into this, I want to come back to something that was raised in the questions before to point out a caveat, which is not all negative articles in our data set are unsympathetic to Muslims, right? Some of them depict Muslims as victims of violence or war. So the graph on the right, the figure on the right, shows the whole corpus, but also then summarizes categories of articles where the most prominent topic was a foreign location. And you'll see here that these two topics, the Bosnia topic and the Kosovo topic, what we call the Bosnia topic and Kosovo topic, clearly have the propensity to portray Muslims as victims, not as engaged in, mostly not as engaged in active violence themselves. And these articles are quite negative. However, what's important to know is that these articles make up 2.7% of all articles in our data set. In other words, they're quite a small proportion. And just as a check, we went and we tagged all articles that mentioned Rohingya and Uyghurs, two other places where Muslims tend to be victims. And adding those in, those are combined with this 3.5% of our data set. So in other words, there are articles out there, including ones set in the United States that have to do with hate crimes against Muslims and things like that, where Muslims are portrayed as victims. But it tends to be a small proportion of the overall set of articles. And even there, I come back to this point, constantly using negative words in the same article as Muslims or Islam is likely to leave a kind of residue of negativity. You're not going to remember all of the articles you ever read, but what you might remember is Muslims equals something negative, right? So I don't want to push too hard on that point because I think there's some scholarly debate about how much that matters for whom and what circumstances. But I do want to point out this caveat to say not all articles that use the word Muslim or Islam are negative about Muslims or Islam. Okay, what are the topics? What are the broader themes present in these articles? Well, violence, law and order, foreign coverage, that's a huge portion of our corpus. And they're all more negative than the corpus average as a whole. These other topics, starting from politics and going to education, less negative than average. But what's kind of striking is that they're all negative, right? There is no one broad theme in our among our topics that is positive. Now, there is one kind of subtopic in here that I'm going to come to in a second, which is what are the least negative single topics? Well, you saw education as one of them. So these are articles that mention schools, schooling, et cetera, students. And I just want to ask, to pause and think about this for a second. How is it that articles about schools and students wind up being negative on average? Right, so that's something that probably requires a little more exploring. The positive topic is the arts, right? So it's a subset of the culture topic. This is the only topic that we could find that actually has a positive valence. So if you want to find positive stories about Islam, Muslims, take a look at some cultural topics. All right, where do we go from here? What are the next steps? What are the conclusions? The first question we wanted to ask is, does this coverage actually matter? Right. So I said we did an experiment that looked at, could people tell apart articles that were a little more positive, a little more negative relative to one another? And the answer was yes. But we also wanted to know, if people are actually reading these articles, our articles, does it influence their attitudes directly? And so we did an experiment with my colleague at Middlebury, Jeffrey Carpenter, where we had 1,013 readers we divided them into 6 groups, and we said, here, read a couple of articles that are about Muslims that are either strongly negative, -2, or neutral, 0, or strongly positive. And for good measure, we said, well, we want to make sure there's not something funky here going on just with Muslim articles. So we had another set of 3 groups read articles about Catholics with valence differences at the same level. And then we said, okay, now please rate your feelings about these groups on a 100-point feeling thermometer scale. Do you feel warmly? That's 100. Do you feel cold about these groups? That's a 0. Or where in between do you rate these groups? So here's the result, right? The result is that when you read negative articles about a group, this is true for both Catholics and Muslims, you feel more negatively about them. And this is this is sort of the immediate aftermath you get when you read articles about a particular group that are framed in a negative way. Now, when you move up to neutral and positive, the results differ a little bit. Catholic treatments are much more stepwise. The Muslim treatments kind of flatten out. There could be a few reasons for that. I can touch on that in the Q&A if people are interested. But the point is, reading negative articles matters. It has an immediate impact on you and your feelings about a group. All right, so here, I just want to kind of recap some of the main points of the talk so they're fresh in everybody's mind. US media coverage of Muslims, very negative, and readers are able to recognize more negative articles. We identify the factors that are most strongly associated with negativity, but no combination of factors can offset the Muslim gap. The difference between how Muslims are covered and average news stories, and the difference between how Muslims are covered and how other groups are covered. The results hold not just for the US, but also for other Anglophone North countries, but don't necessarily hold in the global South. There's a wider variety of valences in those newspapers. And finally, negative attitudes or negative articles do indeed affect attitudes. All right, what are the broader contributions as I wind down here? The first is empirical, right? We have a kind of uniquely extensive newspaper corpus, lots of different groups, more than 2 decades, lots of different countries. And so this, I think, allows us better than ever before to establish some of the major dimensions of how the media covers Muslims. The second is methodological. We have this representative corpus for the United States and others for other countries that allows us to benchmark all articles about any topic, any group in any country against this yardstick, against this benchmark. So you can see not only that articles are negative, but how negative are they? How negative are they compared to average news stories? How negative are they compared to articles about other groups? And then we bring in, as I've discussed, a number of different text as data methods. that help us see more deeply into the articles than simply a sentiment analysis could do on its own. We make some theoretical contributions, I think, to discussions about Islamophobia and boundary making, right? It is clear from this work that Muslims and Islam are described in ways that at best perpetuate, at worst deepen the divide, the perceived boundaries between Muslims and others in our societies. These articles associate Muslims with a tremendous amount of negativity over and over again and again. And so what you see on the right of your screen here is a word cloud, a collocations word cloud, the words that are most commonly found in the proximity to the words Muslim or Islam in the US. And the ones in gray, so the size is the words that are most prominent, that's determined by the size. But what you see in black are the sheer number of words and also the size of many of them that are just strongly associated with Muslims and Islam in US newspapers. The last point I want to bring in is something that's a little more normative and applied. We make an argument in our book that we should start thinking about tone checking the media. So tone checking is a parallel to fact checking, right? So fact checking, like before the media goes to print, it fact checks the stories to make sure they're right. It should also, we believe, tone check the stories. And I mean, the newspaper outlets, media outlets can certainly hire people to do the tone checking to say, are we covering groups fairly? Is this story fair to them? Is the tone right given the events that are going on? But this can also happen at the level of editors who decide which stories to assign and which stories get run, which stories are front page story and which stories are page 22. It can happen at the level of journalists who have to be aware that stories mentioning Muslims are this negative. And so before they just throw in words like extremism and terrorism, which as we saw earlier are in just an incredible number of articles mentioning Muslims and Islam, think twice. Is this story really about terrorism and extremism? Or are you throwing that in because it's just sort of habit, right? So we don't think journalists are out there like trying to be mean to Muslims. There's no plot or conspiracy. There's not outright Islamophobia among journalists themselves who are actively trying to perpetuate these boundaries, but it's a more subtle effect. So we're calling on journalists to be more thoughtful about some of these elements. And then finally, we hope that citizens, and by that I mean mostly the people who read our book or listening to this talk, are just having a raised awareness about how the media covers a group like Muslims. It is very negative. And so when you read the next article that mentions Muslims, hopefully you're triggered a little bit to be like, does this contain a lot of negative words? Is this yet another negative story? Is it a story about Muslims baking cookies, or is it a story about Muslims baking cookies instead of being engaged in terrorism, right? So the idea that we have as readers, can tone check the articles themselves and sort of raise that flag for our own consciousness so that we are not by accident perpetuating these kinds of stereotypes and this kind of subtle Islamophobia that comes out through these articles. All right, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Erik Bleich. And thank you for this great, enriching presentation and all these very valuable insights. It was really great also to listen to the methodology, which was very rich. I was very impressed about all this work you put into this book. And I would like to introduce to the discussion. Asmaa, Soliman, would you like to share your comments or thoughts about the presentation?
Yes, thank you. First of all, thanks a lot to the team of DeZIM for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. And thank you, Erik, for your presentation. I think from what we have heard, we have seen how deep the study has been. And for me, what was interesting, because usually we have, of course, this topic, how Muslims are depicted in media. It's a research topic that has already been examined in various ways, but I'm really impressed by the comparative approach that you have undertaken also on these very different levels, which I think contribute to the to interesting results and also innovative results, I would say. Just on the different levels, different newspapers, on the level of negative versus positive coverage, differences within negative coverage, Muslim stories versus average stories, Muslim stories versus other minorities in the US, Muslim coverage in other Western countries, coverage in countries of the global South around major events, but also the comparison over time. So I think it's extremely, you have taken into consideration various levels, and I'm impressed by that. Also the methods, as Fatima just mentioned, I think just following and hearing about it already made everyone aware how complex this whole issue is, with using different methods and thinking or reflecting very thoroughly why and how we can use them to analyze the data. Also, generally, what I found interesting is that you have looked at the likely drivers of the negative coverage stories, but also like just confirmed that despite the variables, there is still a Muslim gap. I think that's very important, because usually we hear this argument that it's just in relation to these specific drivers, which is wrong. Then what I also found interesting, because it's also something that we hear often not only within academia, but also generally within public discourses, is to look at the 9/11 post and pre-9/11, because we usually tend to assume that 9/11 has changed everything, and that's also not true. And it was good and interesting to see that there is actually, it's more about the volume of and the increase of volume rather than the difference in tone. So it's still the same tone, or the tone has not really changed, and we could find articles before and after that are still having this negative tone. I think that's also very important, because it challenges dominant discourses about this idea that there is this post 9/11 world. Of course, as you said, there are changes, especially in terms of what words are used and what topics we can find mostly, but still it shows us that we are talking about a narrative that has many years of history rather than just a recent history. And what I also found interesting, what you talked about at the end of your presentation, was really, again, to show how this influences, like very strongly, the negative coverage influences public opinion, like how it turns from just reading, which can sound so simple, into feelings, like what happens exactly there. Once we read something about a particular group, we feel, our feeling about this group changes. And I think it has a lot of psychological factors with it, but it just shows, the power and also the danger of media. What else? Also, what you said at the end, the perpetuating the us versus them discourse, which I think is the biggest challenge that we have, and also in how far there, my thought is, even if we can't say it's per se Islamophobic, it lays the ground for Islamophobia, and in how far we can then say that it can be seen as part of Islamophobia just by laying the ground for it. And the last point that you made was also something that I personally think is very important. It's about the tone checking. because we had just a few weeks ago in a meeting that I have attended with the Interior Ministry as part of the Deutsche Islam Konferenz, which is a format including different actors from the German society with the policy levels. And there was also my wish was to somehow install something like that in at least, let's say, private media is maybe something that we cannot control or the state cannot control, but at least in state institutions to have like mechanisms and people who are just hired for that to check the tone. And I was wondering, because you have suggested it, if there is something like that going on in the US, if there are steps into that direction. Yeah, also legally, what is the situation there? That would be, yeah, that would be a question that I would like to ask. And yeah, I have some other questions. I'm not sure if I should just go through them, or would you like to pick up one question at a time?
I'm happy to do it either way. I mean, just so quickly on the answer to this question, I don't know. I suspect not. I don't suspect that there are media organizations that hire people specifically to look for tone. I think it does happen to some degree if there is, for example, a very unsubtle conveyance of racism, sexism, Islamophobia, whatever. That's the editors will probably step in and say, hey, this maybe, you know, this might offend some of our readers. Is this really how you want to put it? And so I think there is some of that goes on just through the habits of the newsroom. To my knowledge, there is no specific person hired to sit there and kind of review lots of articles before they go out, like a fact checker might be, in order to check for the more subtle aspects of tone. Because again, I want to be clear, like, I'm not accusing journalists of outright Islamophobia. Most of them are just trying to get the story done. You know, the editors are trying to meet deadlines. You know, most of them are people of goodwill trying hard to get the story right. But you know, you might think of this as kind of like systemic Islamophobia, something that's more subtle, not down to any one individual's choice, but just the habits of the newsroom, the workplace, the way the media gets produced. Those, I think, need to be reviewed and interrogated a little more. And I think a tone checker, you know, could be a very productive person in that sort of step, so that it doesn't get overlooked.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I also, for me, it was also interesting to look at Germany, actually, and to see what do we have in Germany. And I'm sure that Özgür and Fatima might ask some questions in that direction. Because, of course, I mean, it's no surprise that in Germany, the results are very, very similar. I just had a look at one recent study by Kai Haves and Sabrina Schmidt that was published in 2020, and they examined generally the image of Islam, and they did it within two different areas of media. One is news journalism and the other was film, which was actually very interesting. But what I also found in this publication was that they also looked at like Muslim or racism critical or migrant voices who use media to counter these narratives. And also in the context of the platform where I work, the Junge Islam Konferenz, we actually have developed a media academy just to do that exactly, where we train young people to improve their journalistic skills, to really go out and spread counter discourses, alternative discourses. Yeah, I mean, of course, it's always like when we talk about that, it's always about power dynamics, because at the end, it's the question is what is mainstream and what is heard and what is not heard. That is why I think it's not enough to develop alternative stories in alternative spaces, but it's also about how can you get these alternative stories within the mainstream and to go really within the mainstream. And at the same time, we also see the power of social media that has, unlike like mainstream media, social media has less excluding mechanisms. It's just much easier. Many people can access it and can develop their stories on it. So my question would be also like now talking about the American context, if you think that there are like alternative voices, alternative people, like people who distribute alternative stories, but also alternative media that manage to establish a counter narrative. Also just bearing in mind that it's of course a double effort. And on the one hand, they have to deconstruct all this negative coverage, and then they have to create and offer an alternative coverage. I would like to hear about your view on how things are in the US.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, I want to first of all just make it clear that I'm not an expert on newsrooms, right? So, so there may indeed be some of this stuff going on in newsrooms in the United States that scholars of newsrooms could speak to much more directly. But your comment, your question invites me to refine what I said before by adding that it's not just sort of the same old editors that are there to catch some of the more egregious statements or misrepresentations. It seems to me, I mean, just from what I have seen and what I know, that newsroom minority representation is important for a lot of reasons. But one of the reasons can be that, you know, women, Muslims, African Americans, trans people are much more likely to see this stuff going on, are going to be more attuned to it in the moment than the same editor that's been there for 20 years and just has their kind of set way of doing things. And then to connect it to the social media element, you know, there have been a few instances, for example, in the New York Times, to take a prominent example in the United States, where people in the newsrooms, people employed by the New York Times, have basically raised internally, hey, this was said, this crosses a line, like this is not acceptable. And then oftentimes they've taken that further to social media, which has generated more kind of buzz and more momentum. And then the New York Times has at certain moments changed who's in their employ or how stories get made. So I think the combination of people in the newsroom itself and the connection to social media and the pressure that can come from that can be a force for change. Now, some of that change is going to be is going to be seen by some people as very good and by other people as not so good. So there's also a little bit, I think, of backlash that is being discussed in the US context. So I think it's not, I don't want to leave the impression that I'm saying like, put more marginalized groups in newsrooms and have them amplify voices on social media and all the problems will be solved. I don't think it's quite that easy. But I think if I were going to say, what's the first step, and newspapers are not going to hire tone checkers, often it falls to marginalized groups in organizations to take these steps. And that's kind of unfair burden on them. It's extra work. It's difficult. You're putting your career on the line. You yourself might get fired or not promoted or moved to a beat, as a reporter that's much less desirable. So that I think is a less good solution, but one that's out there and being enacted in the US in several places.
Thank you. My last question would be more in the direction of intersectionality. I would love to hear if you, first of all, in relation to the different topics, did you see that, for example, when we talk about terrorism, it's typically the Muslim man. When we talk about oppression, it's typically the Muslim woman. Did you see like that depending on the topic, we have like there is also a difference in which gender is shown? Yeah, maybe that's the first question. And generally, the second question would be: would you say that it's more like men who are depicted within this coverage, or more women? Do you see like that there is a different, like a difference also on which gender is generally more depicted, but also specifically with regard to the topics? Did you see there, a relation?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the answer is, among all the topics that emerge, so you saw the word cloud, so you get a sense of sort of how we see them. It's, I think, very rare that gender jumps out as an important word, right? So it's not the case, for example, that there is a terrorism topic, and in that topic is the word man, men, there aren't gendered words in that topic. Obviously, you have a topic like Al-Qaeda and bin Laden, where bin Laden happens to be man. So sometimes there are individuals that emerge in those topics. So I think what you need to do to answer that question better, and something we haven't done but could do, is look at the overlap between the topic modeling results about a particular topic and the features that we have that tag articles for the presence of words like woman, women, girls, etc. down the line, and match up and see, is there a propensity of some of those topics to overlap more with women and some of those topics to overlap more with men. But we haven't done that yet.
Thank you. These were my questions, and I see that there are also other questions in the chat, so I will hand over then to our moderators.
Thanks so much for this wonderful conversation. It was really great and insightful, at least for me. We have one question or two questions in the Q&A section. The first question comes from Gökçe. So I'm reading out what she's saying and asking. Thank you, Erik and Moritz. I had the chance to read the book, and I recommend everyone to read it too. I have two questions. First, Erik, you said that the 9/11 did not affect the tone, but changed the discussions on terrorism and extremism. Are there any other events that changed the discussions? Are there any transnational effects? For example, terrorism and Britain or France? Do they change the discussions in the American newspapers? Second, in the book, you write that British news are more negative than others. Can you open this up a bit? What could be the reason that British news are more negative than the news of other countries? Is there a comparable group to Muslims who are represented negatively in Britain?
Okay, sure. Thanks, Gökçe. I appreciate your questions and your invitation here. And thanks for reading the book. So 9/11 affected the words that were used, but not so much the tone. Are there other events that changed the discussion? That's a really good question. And I'm trying to think about whether we looked at specific other events and how they changed the propensity of newspapers to use particular words. And nothing's jumping to mind right now. It may be the case that Moritz has looked into some of that, and it either did or didn't make it into our book. But the one other thing, the thing that I can answer, so the answer to that is, I don't know, and I don't think so, or maybe some combination of both. Are there other events that change the discussion, transnational effects, terrorism in Britain and France? The answer there is yes, in the sense that we know that we looked at the ways in which some other events have changed the number of articles being written and the tone. And some of them are international events, right? They're not all American events. And I'm thinking about French terrorist attacks in particular, which generated some more coverage and more negative coverage. It worked most strongly when the event was proximate to an event in the United States, right? So if it became part of a story of there's a French terrorist attack and then there's an American terrorist attack, then it sort of amplifies the effect. So it's not all, I mean, American newspapers are very American-centric, but it's not all American events that drive coverage. Some of them are foreign events. The British newspapers, yeah, they're very negative. And a big part of that, I mean, you will have noticed that in the slide where I give the comparison of the average valence across the 4 countries, and then normalized according to each country's representative corpus, that the British number moved the most. And it moved the most, as I suggested, because there are a fair number of tabloids in Britain and a fair number of tabloids in our corpus. And so tabloid newspapers, as you saw from the regressions, are associated with even more negativity than non-tabloid newspapers. So the fact that there are a lot of tabloids in Britain, you know, that has an effect. That's a big part of what drives the coverage down. And, you know, a lot of the tabloids are just kind of what you might think of as kind of bog standard negativity, like just, you know, short articles, blaring headlines, trying to get your attention, ramping up the emotional types of responses that you might expect. Some of them, you know, as we say in the book, there are some newspapers, The Sun in particular, that are just like, they seem to be just gratuitously negative about Muslims. I'm not sure if that's still true, but there have been moments in time where certain British tabloids, they get a topic in their wheelhouse and they just run with it, whether it's Brexit or Muslims or whatever it may be. And so there seem to be some periods where these British newspapers just grabbed a hold of this and really pushed it very hard. That may be a function of just kind of British news norms. Is there a comparable group? I don't think so. We haven't found anything in any country that's as negative as Muslims. So if I had to place my marker down, I would say Muslims are probably the most negatively covered in Britain, probably even more so than refugees, asylum seekers, maybe even than the European Commission.
Okay, thanks so much. We have another question by another, but he asked for being included into the video part of it, which is why I suggest that we continue first with the moderator's questions. So I would invite Fatima to pose her questions, and then if we have space, I would pose some of mine, and then we would invite Nader to join us here and pose his questions, because he assumes that there will be a back and forth, and it's hard for him to, yeah, it's a challenge to deal with that in the Q&A section. So Fatima?
I mean, like, I was wondering regarding the gender dimension, which was already mentioned by Asmaa, and the intersectional identity, for example. I was wondering if you have, like, apart from the words, you have found like a tone or direction regarding this gender topic. I mean, like, how are Muslim women depicted or Muslim men depicted? And I think you also, in one of the last slides, you had like women organizations mentioned. So I was wondering also in how far they are relevant also in the use.
Okay, I almost forgot to unmute there. Yeah, these are really good questions. And honestly, we thought that gender would be more of a standout category than it turned out to be. So we anticipated doing a deep dive into coverage of, in particular, headscarves and these kinds of issues that have come up over and over again. I suspect that part of why we don't see as much of that, I'm just pausing to think, am I sure that this is true? I think it's true for the United States. right? Where headscarves have just been less of an issue in the United States than they have been in many European locations, where the public display of religious, affiliation is not as controversial as it is in many European societies. But I think it's also not that prominent in Britain, where public displays of religiosity are also a little less looked down upon than in a place like France in particular. But the coefficient for culture, like value clash, right? Which, as you saw, if you have in mind that the regression equation, it's sort of to the right of 0. But of course, 0 doesn't mean like 0 neutral. 0 just means like the average article. But the average article is really negative. So even though articles that touch on kind of cultural issues, gender is one of them, right? We have a variable for women that includes all the words for women. They're not negative variables, but they're still associated with, there's still a lot of negativity associated with articles that touch on those topics, because as you saw from the topic graph, like every topic is negative. Education is negative. So, we didn't do a deep dive into that because it turned out in the context of what we were looking at not to be as striking as some of the other things. But there's plenty of work to be done to unpack that and look at that more closely.
Thank you very much. I would like to reply to that or add something. Actually, I was wondering, because you were mentioning there is this negative and positive tone, but when you were mentioning, for example, there were, I think, 2 topics which were more positive, like education and culture. And also with regard to intersectionality and gender, I was asking myself, at least in Germany, there is a controversy about the conceptualization of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism. And when we talk about the representation of Muslim women or Muslims in general, there could be like a positive form of representation, but still it might reproduce stereotypes. So I was wondering also with regard to these 2 topics, for example, if you could elaborate more on your findings regarding these 2 topics, which are supposedly positive, but at the same time might also reinforce stereotypical images of Muslims.
Yeah, those are great questions. And I think they get back to, the discussion we were having a little earlier about, well, okay, so the articles are negative, but what does that mean, right? Are they negative about Muslims, or they just have negative words? And the truth is, I can't answer your question super well because, as you know, we have 1.6 million articles. So I haven't read them all, I'll admit that. And so what we did is we tried to figure out what were the things that jumped out at us, and then took a bit of a deeper dive into those things. Why are articles negative about schools? Well, sometimes that's because you have stories about, like Muslim schools in Pakistan that are, training jihadis, so sometimes the word school pops up in those kinds of contexts. So it's not maybe surprising that some of those articles are negative, but the articles that are really about schooling per se, I'm not entirely sure. I can guess that some of them may have to do with controversies over, are you allowed to wear a headscarf in school? What do you do? Like some of these things in the European context, I would have a better guess at actually what's in there that are controversial topics. But in the US articles, I can't think off the top of my head if we looked deeply into what those articles are about. On the broader point, I think you're absolutely right that some articles that appear to be or are quantifiably neutral in terms of the words that they use might not have the effect of being sort of like, oh, it's just Muhammad baking a cookie. Like, Muhammad's, I bake cookies, Muhammad bakes cookies, like clearly we're the same. Like that's like, it decreases stereotypes. Some of these articles may actually reinforce some stereotypes without even mentioning the cookie bomb. right? So I think that to answer those kinds of questions requires a different methodology, one that's much more qualitative. And I would say you could, I could imagine combining it with some of our quantitative methods to say, okay, now we've identified the subset of articles that is heavily loaded for the topic of schooling. Let's pull a sample of 100 of those articles, a random sample of 100, and actually read them very closely with an eye towards what are they about, but also how are they maybe conveying, reinforcing, or undermining some stereotypes. Let me know if you want that sample. I'll send it your way.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for this. We have another question now from Bastian, which I would read then, and then I would invite Nader, and then I would see whether there is any space for me to pose my questions, or I will come up with a wrap up. So Bastian asks, not sure if I've seen it right, but it seemed to me that in the last slide, Muslims were received warmer than Catholics. If so, why do you think that is, especially in regards to the much more negative news coverage? Also, do you think that anti-Muslim racism is especially fueled by media coverage compared to other forms of discrimination, like, for example, anti-Black racism, as African Americans received much more positive news coverage, yet undoubtedly experienced tremendous racism? How can we think the relationship between the media and stigmatization in a way that accounts for these differences?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Bastian. Those are both great questions. On the first one, you're right. You caught that right. The scale was different for Muslims and Catholics, and the scale starts at a higher level for Muslims than for Catholics. And why is that? Well, the first thing I need to say is we were not trying to get a representative sample, because for our purposes, what we needed to know was controlling for a bunch of other things. Is reading a negative article more likely, all else equal, to make you feel more negative than reading a neutral or a positive article? And so for that question, you don't really care what the scale is, but it is true that the scale is higher for Muslims. Why is that? Well, it's because we didn't get a representative sample. And so the people who responded to this survey were much more likely to be left-leaning than right-leaning, and therefore, as a baseline, much more likely to feel more warmly towards Muslims than the average American, if we looked at a survey of all Americans, but also probably more likely to feel more warmly towards Muslims than towards Catholics. So we did do some further analysis. Our colleague Jeff Carpenter and we've been batting around the idea of writing that up as a separate paper, but that's the short answer to that very good question. The second question is a good one, but a really hard one to answer, right? So I think I would say it's probably better to think about it as American media coverage is less thoughtful and less prone to self-tone check when it writes about Muslims than it is when it writes about African Americans. So I think that might help explain why some of the articles about Muslims, many of the articles about Muslims, are really, really negative. Because if you're born and raised in the United States and you're a journalist, so therefore educated, and you have a sense of the communities you're covering and the national tone of politics and society, you are probably unlikely to write an article that is thoughtlessly negative about African Americans. That was not true in the 1980s or in the 1990s, when there were plenty of studies of communication that showed that lots of articles were really negative about African Americans, more so than they probably should have been. Now I think that's different. But so then the question is, does the more positive coverage of African Americans help minimize in any way the negative attitudes towards African Americans? I don't know the answer to that. Does the more negative coverage of Muslims help aggravate negative attitudes towards Muslims? Probably would be my answer. So I would say the media probably plays a bigger role when attitudes are less fully developed or fully formed about a group than when they are more fully developed and more fully formed. So I don't know if that fully answers the question, but I hope that helps.
Great, thanks a lot. So right now I'll pose my question, and then we'll see whether we have a chance to invite another. If not, we can have the discussion between Nader and you at another point in time. So my questions. First of all, I was wondering about like you were presenting very nicely the role of 9/11, how the discussion changed, and what I observed in this graphs was that the topic extremism increased after that and terrorism decreased, which was pretty anti-intuitive for me, because one would expect terrorism to increase and extremism to decrease. And then I was wondering what could be the reason behind that. Is it because now the threat is seen as an internal one, while it was seen as an external one before? So it's a foreign threat. It moved from a foreign threat to an internal threat, but that's just a hypothesis that came to my mind. And I was wondering whether you have some better explanations, more empirically induced explanations for that. I was wondering about the negative portrayals in Muslim majority societies. That's also, again, very anti-intuitive for me. If I think about or think of Turkey, and I cannot imagine that Muslims and Islam is presented negatively in the news in Turkey. But I mean, you know, I might be wrong, right? I didn't do the systematic and empirical analysis for that, but it's pretty, surprising for me to see that a Muslim majority society, self-portrays negatively in a way. And then the next question relates to events, the role of events, because you mentioned 9/11, and I saw that there are like some smaller peaks in the process, and I was wondering whether there are also events lurking behind those small peaks. That would be interesting to see the evolution of political events, of crises, however one would like to label them. That's my questions. And regarding the gender part, because we had this also in our manuscript, like how to deal with certain dimensions of social inequality. You believe they're there, but they're not in the word clouds, like specific, like explicitly not there, but you know that, for instance, behind the names, that there's a gender identity behind the name, or other forms of social inequality being sort of encoded in the words we see. And then whether the research strategy is or has to be a sort of qualitative one to extract the text passages, for instance, the sentences. And then, of course, you could also have a quantitative analysis of the extracted sentences or text passages. But if that's the strategy to deal with these dimensions of social inequality, which are sort of in the shadow of the words. Yes, that were my questions.
All right, just a couple easy softballs. Okay, so first thing I want to do is just share my screen for a second to come back to this terrorism and extremism point. So let me go ahead and do this. Okay, so everything went up, right? So after 9/11, everything jumped. Extremism a little less than terrorism, as you might expect in the wake of a prominent terrorist attack. And then the mentions of terrorism declined, but never to the same level. And the mentions of extremism basically kind of keep going up for quite a while. And as you can see in the note here, you know, one thing to perhaps consider is that, you know, when terrorism is mentioned and extremism isn't, then it sort of implies, like it doesn't articulate the notion that terrorism is perpetrated by extremism. likely, right? I'd want to go in and look more closely at those articles and see how it was framed exactly, but that's one potential implication. But so I guess maybe I didn't fully understand your question, but they both went up. It's just that terrorism sort of dropped down after a while extremism keeps going up. So I think the bottom line is here that American newspapers are concerned with extremism over the long run, and extremism includes tags for words like extremist, but also fundamentalist, radical, militant, those types of words that are very prominent in the American media. Does that answer that question?
Yes, the question was, of course, both go up, but why extremism is outnumbering terrorism? What, you know, the justification for that, basically.
Yeah, right. So hopefully that last part was the answer to that, which is, I think, you know, when there aren't specific terrorist attacks, that may go down a little bit, and it may rise and fall based on terrorist attacks. And so this brings me to your second question, which is, yes, a lot of the spikiness in the data set in terms of article counts is really related to specific events, in particular specific terrorist attacks or the invasion of Iraq or something like that. So it is very much events driven, especially the article counts. Let's see. So negative coverage of Muslims in Muslim majority countries. That's another one, like, you know, so my answer to this is going to be unfortunately similar to my answer to what's in the education stories, which is we haven't looked too deeply in, I mean, I think Pakistan is really the one where I'd want to go next and look a little more closely at what's the negativity in those stories. If I had to guess, and I'm really just guessing here, I would say, you know, domestic attacks by groups that self-describe as Islamic, have Islamic in the name of their group, might be driving some of that. So again, this gets to the point where not all stories that are negative that mention Islam or Muslims are sort of targeting Islam and Muslims for opprobrium, right? They include a lot of negative words, but they're not necessarily explicitly negative about Muslims. And yeah, I'd love to do this analysis on Turkey and see if it's any different, right? If it's more like Malaysia or more like Pakistan. Okay, so the word clouds and how to deal with some of those subtleties. One of the methods that we have that you know about, but that we didn't talk about in this presentation is something called quick analysis, KWIC, keywords in context. And so that makes it really easy. How does this work? You basically say, I would like to see all sentences that contain the word hijab. Pull those for me. Oh, there are 80,000 sentences. I don't want to read all those. Give me a 1% sample, random sample. And it pulls those sentences, and then you can start to read those sentences and really get a better sense for what's going on in those sentences. And then if you want to know, you know, do sentences that contain the word terrorism, are they more likely to contain the word man than woman or men than women? You can take those sentences and you can search in them and funnel down to the subset of sentences that contain the word terrorism and man or men compared to woman or women. And so, yes, I would say to get at some of these more fine-grained nuance elements, it's not just pulling, you don't have to be as blunt as pull a random sample of 100 articles. You can really refine the process so that you're focused on the sentence level, you're focused on articles that contain certain pairings of words. There's a lot of that kind of work that can be done to really narrow it down to the more specific context that you're interested in. And I would say that's the way forward.
Great, thanks a lot. So we are now finally at the point where we invite our surprise act, Nader Hotait, to pose us questions. I'm just assigning him the role of participating in the panel here. So
if Maurits is still with us, you might want to invite him in too, because if the questions become more technical on this front, he might have better answers than I would.
Then we have two surprise acts, even better.
Yeah, but can you see me? Is that possible? Otherwise, it's okay. Then I can just use my voice. Thank you very much, Erik, for this very insightful and intricate presentation. I loved it very much and was very, very intrigued by it over the course of it. And
sorry, I'm getting a little background noise.
Yeah, me too.
That was coming from Moritz, but I muted him.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so he has little kids in the house, so he may be a little distracted. Go ahead. Sorry.
What is interesting for me, I mean, before we discuss anything technical, I think what is interesting in this very specific case is with a endeavor like that, I think obviously it will be written with a lot of like biases and issues and gender selection and confounding factors. But I think in this case, they all do have a meaning, right? And they can contribute to a lot of meaning. For example, we could say, well, the newspapers might have a selection bias going on, or endogenous to some extent, because, well, yeah, with race issues, media outlets now have practiced some sort of like language training where they know what codes to use, what dog whistles to use, what words to employ, and to stay on the safe side and how to frame certain things and not, and to avoid public backlash or maybe the Twitter bubble going at them, whatever. And that might not be granted for Muslims. So that's might be that the cases are, or the case selection might be now comparable, we could say. But what I like about this specific topic is then the question is why? Why are Muslims not treated with the same grace in public media? Why are certain word embeddings constantly linked towards Muslims? And I think this perspective is very interesting. And I'd like to hear your perspective on, for example, are there certain media outlets that tend to be exclusively more negative towards Muslims? There are certain things, for example, what I could think of is that maybe in Muslim majority countries, Muslims are not self-referential. In that case, that they talk about themselves as Muslims. At the same case, a lot of issues that are framed in the UK towards Muslims just means we're talking about Pakistani and Somali immigrants. So we have this issue of ethnicization, where we are basically talking about ethnicities. And this also only contributes to the, how could we say, well, to the media coverage of Muslims being lumped in together with everything negative anybody does at some point. And I would like to hear your perspective on that issues, like certain biases occurring and what they do actually mean, how it further strengthens the argument that Muslims are being talked about badly in public news.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, I mean, you know, the other caveat I will make based on your observation about what does it mean when British journalists mention Muslims? Are they really talking about Pakistani ethnic origin people, Pakistani immigrants, Somali refugees? What is that a code for? What does it stand for? Is I don't think of any of these categories as hermetically sealed, right? So we chose articles that mention the word Muslim and Islam because we think that those are going to get at, those are most likely to get most centrally at how people interpret, believe, develop attitudes towards Muslims and Islam. But of course, Muslims and Islam overlap with all sorts of other categories that we use in different societies. And in different societies, they overlap with different groups. Sometimes all you have to read in French news is Maghrébin, and you assume Muslim, right? So you're also missing out on a bunch of articles that might trigger a relationship in somebody's mind with Muslims by only selecting for words like Muslim and Islam. But I just think that's, you know, on some level, you have to acknowledge that uncertainty and that fluidity, but you also have to kind of embrace it in the sense that it's hard to imagine any perfect study. And I'm not saying you were asking for a perfect study, but what I'm saying is, I think trying to understand exactly what is being said when somebody says Muslim is really difficult. And I don't think we have an answer for that in this book or in this project. But I do think that we get at what each society tends to write about when it writes about Muslims. Maybe in the future, these newspapers will develop more subtle ways of talking about these groups. I do want to share one more slide just to show one quick bit of information that might be helpful for another part of your question. Okay, can you see that slide? So this is the slide of all the newspapers with, in the final column, the average valence of each individual newspaper. And I think this is important for two reasons. It shows that there is a spread of average valences. It shows, oops, the color coding got swapped between USA Today and Washington Post here, so never mind those colors. But it shows that our major newspapers, the New York Times, I don't know if you can see my cursor. Can you see my pointer? Okay, so the major papers, the New York Times and the Washington Post, those have most of the articles. They're right at the Corpus average. The most positive newspaper is, I believe, the San Jose Mercury News. Where did my pointer go? Down here. And the most negative is the New York Post. So there's a spread, but everybody is negative, right? Every newspaper winds up being negative. So I think the other thing to note is if there is going to be a shift where newspapers get more subtle, more self-reflective and self-restrained in how they write about Muslims, it hasn't happened yet. It hasn't happened in any newspaper that we looked at yet. So that may be something to hope for in the future. And it may indeed develop over time, but it's not here yet.
Thanks a lot. I don't know whether Nader would like to pose another question, since we are.
No, I just wanted to make a quick point. No, I think my point was, which I think would further underpin the points you're making, which is if we could think of any methodological biases that might occur here, I think all of them would still point to the fact that it would only strengthen the argument more that the Muslim coverage is bad. For example, while they are talking about ethnicities but mentioning Muslims, well, it means then Muslim coverage is still being used as a scapegoat to refer to other categories. If you would say, well, yeah, we don't find much differences because people do not tend to talk about race the way they did back a few decades ago, and they're using dog whistles or codings that are difficult to decipher, that are not explicit like that. Well, then we could say, well, why do Muslims do not be granted the same grace? And I feel like this is so such a, how can I say, convincing part of the research you're doing here, which is like, no matter what biases we can find in this case, or no matter what issues might occur methodologically, I think most of them would point to the fact that, well, then Muslim coverage only looks worse if we account for them. That makes it so interesting.
Thank you. Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't fully understand that that element of it. And just to add to that, one more thing that I didn't mention in the talk, you know, we chose newspapers largely because they are sort of the most sober, restrained medium out there, right? So if you think about like tabloids as being even more negative than broadsheet newspapers, and then you think about sort of websites, you know, that are trying to get clicks, or you think about news channels that offer, you know, news channels or like Fox News that offers, you know, sort of more sensational coverage, Our suspicion is that our newspaper data understates, if anything, the negativity that's out there in the media sphere as a broader whole.
Well, that was a great wrap up. I'd like to add another wrap up to that before we close today's lecture and today's great talk by Erik and the discussion by Asmaa. First of all, I'd like to point to the fact that I found it very convincing that you implemented the resonance or demand side of that, right? So we have this production side of knowledge in the public, but you additionally try to address, or you did address, the resonance side of it, and which I find very interesting. And there's, I'm sure you know, this very interesting piece by Tavery and colleagues, the theory of resonance, which is, right, you know, it's a very timely article, and it tells us that we need to try to attempt to address the resonance part of it, which you very convincingly did, in my view. The other point is that, so your research points to many new avenues for further research. It's just been the case with what Nader said, but also, right, the whole gender discussion we had, which cries for further research. Then, you know, certain cases like Turkey, or understanding Britain better, the UK better, understanding Turkey, or other countries, or also within the countries you looked at, to dig into a certain differences or similarities. So this is something I find very interesting, because it brings about more questions. It delivers answers and brings about more questions, which is very well, which is simply wonderful. And then my final point is the point about tone checking, because this is something I think is very important when it comes to transferring academic knowledge into the public sphere. And I believe that this is a concept which is very useful, which could be very useful. Of course, we're not, I mean, you know, as social scientists, we always, or I suspect many of us, are having doubts about their role in society and their impact. And these kind of concepts, academic concepts, I think are very transferable. Of course, you know, we will not go to the next news board event or meeting and then tell people that there is something like tone checking and they should stick to it from today on. But we know that political actors can lobby around the concept if we create these kind of concepts, and then political actors can adopt them and can lobby around them, which is why I think it's a very convincing concept. It shows that it's the case with Muslims all over the world, basically. So it's empirically robust. It's a very systematically collected and analyzed empirical data. And what I find convincing too is that we then could talk about tone checking instead of fact checking, because the subliminal message of fact checking is that you are a liar, right? And if you talk about tone checking, you're not telling the other that, I mean, in times of debates on polarization and so on and so forth, you're not telling the other on the other side that he or she is a liar, but he should be maybe more careful about the tone, while the message could be a good one or a right one. So it's not about manipulating facts, but being more careful about the tone we use. That being said, that's my wrap up. Thanks so much for this great event. You know that we will have we will upload this on YouTube, so please feel free to circulate it in and through your networks. Thanks so much for this event.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you also from my side. It was really a pleasure to go into discussion with you and to have you here, both of you. Thank you very much.
See you.